So welcome to Composting Indoors. My name is Marissa Nolan. I am an environmental educator with Cornell Cooperative Extension in Schuyler County. I focus on composting, horticulture, and local foods. I have two co-presenters with me today who I'm now going to ask them to introduce themselves. So Debbie, if you want to start.
I'm Debbie Ball. I'm one of Marissa's volunteers at Cooperative Extension. I've been composting myself for a long time. And when I went through the Master Gardener training, I started refining my technique. So that's why I'm here talking about composting tonight. And Heather is the third presenter.
Hi, I'm Heather Gilbert, and I also volunteer for CCE with Marissa with all things compost. I'm also the owner of Finger Lakes Compost locally in the area. I have advanced knowledge of composting. I've taken a course through Cornell for compost operations, and I stay up to date on education through the USCC, which is the United States Composting Council. So I'm here for all the good things that have to do with dirt. Thanks for joining.
Okay, so we're going to go over a couple of different types of composting indoors and how to stockpile your composting and your food scraps. And the first thing that we're going to cover today is stealth composting with Debbie.
It has such a funny name. But stealth composting is really just building an outdoor regular compost pile indoors in a container. And the decomposers that are going to work on your kitchen scraps for you are the same decomposing bacteria and fungi that you find in an outdoor pile. So the same guidelines apply to building a good stealth compost pile. You need to have a nice mix of greens and browns to keep your decomposers happy. You want to have really good airflow, so you're encouraging the decomposers that need oxygen, so your compost pile will smell really nice. And you need to have the right amount of moisture. Also, the kitchen scraps that you're putting into your compost pile should be vegan, except you can include eggshells if you happen to have eggshells. Next slide, please. So what equipment do you need? You need 2 containers and you need 1 lid. The containers can match if you want, but they don't have to. But one needs to fit inside another. The 10-gallon kitchen waste baskets here might actually be a really nice size for a household too that cooks a moderate amount. Next slide, please. I happened to set up a stealth compost bin in 2 5-gallon buckets because I do most of my composting outdoors. I was just making a little demo. So 2 buckets, 1 lid. The inner bucket, which is on the right here, can be kind of beat up if that's what you happen to have. Mine has a big gap in the rim. Next slide, please. So getting these buckets ready. This is the inner bucket we're looking at. I've drilled some holes in the bottom. They're about a 1/2 inch, and these are to help with the airflow coming up through the bottom of the bucket you'll actually be building the compost pile in. The bucket on the left that's sort of off the picture is the outer bucket. That should be in good shape. So just in case you have any liquid leaking out the bottom of your compost pile, it'll get caught and won't go all over your kitchen floor. But ideally your pile won't be that wet. So there shouldn't be any leakage, but there might be. Next slide, please. This is the outer bucket. And to start getting things ready, put a really good layer of wood chips in the bottom of the outer bucket. These are to help with the airflow so air can get up into those holes that you drilled in the inner bucket. I put in about a 6 or 8 inch layer of wood chips in this, prunings actually. And the reason I did that shows up in the next slide. Next slide, please. By having such a thick layer of wood chips in the bottom bucket, when I stack the two buckets together, the inner bucket is actually really resting on those wood chips. And that means there's a gap, an air gap between the side walls of the inner and the outer bucket. So air can flow down through that gap, around in the wood chips in the outer bucket, and up through the air holes that you can see in the bottom of the inner bucket here. Next slide, please. Put a little layer of wood chips in the bottom of this inner bucket. Again, this is to help with airflow. And make it a fairly thin layer. An inch is probably enough, because at this point you're taking up the space that you're trying to build your compost pile in. Next slide, please. Because my wood chips were so chunky, I added a very thin layer of straw, or you might add a layer of torn up cardboard, or this layer is totally optional, actually. So basically the wood chips in the bottom of the bucket. Next slide, please. Just like with an outdoor compost pile, the stealth compost bin on the left, but just like with an outdoor pile, keep your bucket of brown material nearby so that every time you add greens to your compost bucket, you will remember to cover them with browns before you walk away. The browns that I happen to use are something called core. It's the outer husky fibers from coconut. I had it left over from another project. Shredded paper would work really well. Torn up cardboard will work well. Sawdust will work also. Just be thinking on the small side, because it's a limited space that you're building your compost pile in. Next slide, please. Now we're ready to really start building this compost pile. Start with a layer of browns on the bottom. And the reason you do this is this will help make sure that the ratio of greens to browns, of kitchen scraps to the high carbon stuff you're using as browns, you want the volume ratio of greens to browns to be 1 to 3 in order to really help your decomposers be happy. The other thing you're going to be trying to control as you build your compost pile is the moisture. On average, an ideal moisture for a compost pile is to feel like a damp sponge that you've wrung all the moisture out of, wrung all the wet out of. Your kitchen scraps will usually be wetter than that. So the browns can be a little bit drier than that, but they can't be totally dry. So I happened to have moistened this core ahead of time from leftover from what I had been using it for. And the shredded paper or cardboard or sawdust will need to be moistened some as you're building your pile. Next slide, please. Here's the first layer of kitchen scraps. I think I cooked soup that day. So there's onion peels and celery leaves and carrot peels. Tea bags, coffee filters are always in the compost at my house. I tend to save my kitchen scraps for the day and take them to the compost pile once at the end of the day. So that's what I did with the stealth compost setup. This was about 3 or 4 cups of kitchen scraps, which turns out to be a really nice amount for this size container to spread out in a nice thin layer. I've cut them a little smaller than I might if I was putting them in the outdoor pile, because if they're smaller, they'll decompose more quickly. The bacteria and fungi that are going to break these down can only work on the surface of the kitchen scraps. And so the smaller they are, the more surface area there is for the decomposition to take place. Next slide, please. Cover those kitchen scraps with browns. Next slide, please. And put on the lid. The lid helps keep the moisture in so that your pile doesn't dry out as the kitchen scraps are decomposing. But you need to let air escape at the top. The air holes are letting air in at the bottom, and you need to let that air get out the top of your compost bin so that the oxygen loving decomposers are the ones you're encouraging. So leave the lid a little bit ajar, or you can drill holes in the lid to let the air out. Or in my case, I had a big gap in the rim of that inner bucket, and that's where the air is escaping out the top. I tied a piece of screening over that gap just to keep the greens and browns from falling out once the bucket gets really full. Next slide, please. The next day I made applesauce. So I had apple peels and cores and more tea bags and coffee filters to go in. Next slide, please. Cover those with browns. Put on the lid until the next time you'll be adding greens. Next slide, please, is greens. Salad the next day. Next slide, please. Cover it with browns. Put on the lid until the next time you'd be adding greens. And I kept doing that for about a week. Next slide, please. And at that point, my 5-gallon bucket was full, which is why I know 5 gallons is really too small. Just 1 week was not quite long enough. So let's say you're using a 10-gallon container, it would probably last more than 2 weeks because the food scraps you've put in earliest at the bottom will have already started decomposing by the time you get up close to the top of your bin. Once your bucket is full, check it for moisture, put on the lid. Every couple days, come back. You can make sure there's a little moisture condensation on the bottom of the lid. And if there's not, there wasn't a couple times I checked on it. You might sprinkle on a 1/4 cup of water to soak in a little bit. And while this starts to decompose, you can set up a second stealth composting system so that you can keep doing something with your kitchen scraps. This might get warm on top as the decomposers are doing their job, but it might not because it's a pretty small setup. And like I said, just keep checking the moisture. If it gets too dry, the decomposers can't grow and multiply. So you need to keep it like that damp sponge on average. The active phase of composting is going to take about 2 months for this to really cook down, is the term I use. I don't know what an official term might be. And by the end of that 2 months, on average, you will have lost about 1/3 to 1/2 of the volume of what is in this bucket. And at that point, the active phase is finished. I had about a month from when I set this up to when this workshop is happening. Next slide, please. And even in just that month, the volume in the stealth compost bucket had decreased about 2 inches. And so once the active phase has finished, you can scoop out all the decomposed material and start reusing your bucket as a new stealth compost setup. Even though it was only 1 month that had passed, I dug through this. Next slide, please, Marissa, to see what was there. The empty inner bucket is on the left. I dug down to the wood chips and straw layer, so now I'm ready to reuse that if I want to. The rectangular tray in the middle has the things that had not decomposed yet, and it's primarily tea bags and butternut squash rinds. I know they will decompose eventually. They just didn't have quite long enough yet. And next slide, please. All the things that I could not find as identifiable pieces of vegetable scraps, they're all in here. The celery leaves and the carrot peels had disappeared into the browns. This looks like finished compost, but it really isn't quite done yet. This stuff needs to stabilize before you would use it on really mixed in with your plants. And that takes a year, more or less. So this is a game in patience also, doing the composting. The best place for it to age is outdoors in the sun and rain and air. So if you have an outdoor pile, you can put this decomposted stuff on there. You can just put it right on top. You might spread it on a garden bed that you won't be planting until a little later in the season. So it has a chance to, it's January now, by June, that's 5 months. It will have had a chance to break down quite a bit, but just spread it on the top, I think, rather than mixing it in somehow. This isn't full of the things that plants can actually use yet. So leaving it on top and letting it break down and then just letting those sift down into the soil seems like the way to go about it. Next slide, please. So I think I mentioned all these things, but just in case I didn't, the 10-gallon kitchen waste basket would be a better size than 5 gallons. Some people even use 20 gallons. That will get kind of heavy to lift, but it would last you a good long time. And in case you run out of space in your first setup, you can start a second one. Or once the active decomposing is done, just fish that decomposed material out and restart with the same bucket. Cutting the pieces smaller of your kitchen scraps will help the decomposition happen more quickly. And try and keep the average moisture around damp sponge consistency so that there's enough moisture, but there's still plenty of airspace for airflow. So that is stealth composting. It's just like a tiny outdoor pile. And Heather is going to show you how to do a different setup to deal with your kitchen scraps.
Thanks, Debbie. I'm going to go into vermicomposting. So what is vermicomposting? Vermicomposting is composting with worms, and a specific type of worm, a red wiggler worm. You can't just use any earthworm out of the ground. It has to be the red wigglers. They are proven to eat organic matter viciously and convert it into a casting, which is a soil amendment. So essentially just vermicomposting is a worm composting. They do most of the work. I'm going to go into the setup of vermicomposting, which piggybacks off of kind of Debbie's setup, which is really nice. It gives you 2 different options. You can do indoors in the cold months, but using basically essentially similar bins. So whatever works best for you. I do know children love the vermicomposting, the worms and all that. And I think it's kind of magical that you just give them their ingredients and they digest them all and then give you something that's very valuable. So here with vermicomposting, the materials needed are 2 to 3 5-gallon buckets. And at the end of this, I'll show you pictures of other bin styles you can use, but essentially 5-gallon buckets tend to be something we all have laying around. They don't have to be in perfect shape. And then with that, you also are going to need some bedding, food scraps, and of course, worms. So next slide. So right here is essentially going to show you how your buckets are going to be set up. Bucket A is going to be your bottom bucket always. This is going to collect any liquid. As Debbie was talking about, composting creates a liquid, a leachate, or a compost tea, which we'll go into also. Bucket B has holes in the bottom, similar to the bucket system Debbie was showing you. You drill holes in the bottom, and then you also put holes around the rim. And all of this is so that there's a lot of aeration. And also with the vermicomposting, the worms need to mitigate up as they go through their bedding and their food scraps. And those holes will be large enough for them to actually go right up through the buckets. And then bucket C is the one that'll have the lid on top that also has holes in the bottom and on the sides. And bucket C is the one that you'll add on if you want to keep your system just continually going, if you don't want to do just a one-time harvest. Next slide. Here's another picture to just show you more of the material images on what you're using. Bucket A, as you can see, has no holes. Bucket B has your bedding underneath that, mixed in with that. I apologize. Bucket B has the bedding, C has the lid on it, but you can't see inside of it. But that's where your worms and your bedding and your food scraps will go. Bucket B, you'll keep bedding in to absorb liquid and such. Next slide. So here's just showing that you can drill holes with a handheld drill. I know some people don't always have hand tools like that. So if you use just a punch and a hammer, if you have broken buckets, kind of like Debbie was showing you that there was a little gap in hers, that would work too. Use what you have to try to make the holes. Go to your neighbor if you need to and have them drill holes in your buckets. Next slide. Here's another image where they're just showing you the bucket with the holes on the side. These holes are going to be about 1/8 of an inch. That would be just fine, and that would be good for all of your holes, even your bottom holes, because that's large enough to let the worms mitigate to where they need to go. Next slide. And then this is the bottoms of bucket B and C. So this is where the worms need to be able to go through. This is where the castings will drop through to the bottom, and any liquid will drop down to the very bottom bucket, bucket A. Next slide. Okay, so here is essentially when you're putting it together. So I'm going to go into a little more depth on exactly what you're putting in these buckets. So bucket A is empty. You're going to stack B on top of that, and that's going to have your worms, your food waste, and your bedding. So let's talk about bedding. Your bedding material is your browns. Just like any other composting pile, you got to have your browns, and that material can include shredded newspaper, it can be shredded cardboard, brown leaves, straw, coconut fiber, old sawdust. Small is the key. The smaller, the better. The worms actually digest this brown material. So you want to make sure that smaller is better. And you can also add a little sand or soil for grit. That's always a good thing, but it's not necessary. And as far as your bedding, you're going to always want 3 to 4 inches of bedding. And with that, it's also got to be a little damp. So when I say damp, I say like a wrung out sponge, the feeling of a wrung out sponge. You want your bedding to be kind of moistened at that level. So whether you just put some water in there, or if you're like on your second session, you can go ahead and use some of the leachate to moisten the bedding. And then your food scraps that you're mixing in there, they will have some moisture content. So you want to remember that. And that also gives liquid to the bedding to keep the worms very happy. So the worms do most of the work for you, but just like any compost pile, you have to make sure you're on top of it. You don't want any of the food scraps not getting consumed fast enough, where you'll get odors. The more you work with it, the finished product will come faster. So if you're daily just on top of it and not letting it kind of get lost after you set it up, that's the best answer. And worms are alive and very active, and they need to be fed every day, just like the humans. So you want to make sure that you're on top of this kind of composting. The food scrap. So you want to vegan and vegetarian, and also with that, you're also going to want to be careful. Worms aren't completely fond of citrus kind of fruits. They don't do dairy products, they don't do fatty or oily foods, and they don't do fish bones or anything that's like non biodegradable or compostable. I guess I should say not biodegradable. You can put your tea bags in there and your coffee grounds, that's excellent, but you want to make sure that you don't have any staples, rubber bands, any kind of contaminants in there with them. And with food scraps, you could weigh them if you wanted to get really crazy, but you don't necessarily have to weigh them. You kind of just need to know what your ratio of worms is. So when you start, you'll know roughly when you start because you're going to have to purchase worms or get worms from somebody. So I normally would say a half a pound of worms to a pound. A half a pound of worms is roughly 500 worms, and that's a great start for an indoor composting bin. And a half a pound of worms amazingly eats a quarter to a half a pound of food scraps a day. So they're mighty in size on what they can do. So that's the other thing, is you really have to make sure that you're tending to their needs, so that they can be successful. And then you mix this all together. You mix the bedding and the food scraps all together, and the worms will do the work for you. They will consume it all, and what they leave behind is a beautiful casting, which is worm poop. And it's a miracle type of soil amendment. I mean, I don't know exactly, as I'm not the scientist, but it's very much more nutrient dense than your average compost soil that you would have either stealth composting or in your backyard. It's very nutrient dense, so a lot goes a long way. So that's just amazing. These little worms will do all that for you. So next slide. There's the worms. So like I said, you want to make sure that you have red wiggler worms. You can get online and order them, or if you have a compost pile outside, you can go ahead and dig them out there. You can call someone like Finger Lakes Compost, and we could get you hooked up with some red wigglers if you need also. But it's super important that you have the right worms. An earthworm does not consume organic material like the red wiggler does, and they also go to a different level when they consume things. So it's just important to have the red wiggler. Next slide. Here's after you're all set up and you have your worms doing their thing, you're going to want to essentially harvest what they're creating. So it takes about 3 to 6 months to have a good pile of castings. So at that point, if you decide you want to continue this, it's something that you really like, you would place bucket C on top, you'd put your bedding and your food scraps in there, and the worms will go from bucket B up to C all on their own. You won't have to do anything. You'll just want to go and check regularly. It shouldn't take long, about 24 hours or less, and the worms will go right where they need to go because they're hungry. And then everything will go up to C. You can pull bucket B out and harvest your castings. And then bucket A will have any liquid that may have run off from the castings and the whole vermicomposting method. Next slide. So here's, as I said in the beginning, kind of roundabout what your buckets look like. You could use Rubbermaid totes, which is another option I know a lot of households have. It's very similar. You would do the A, B, and C again if you wanted to, by stacking a third one on there. Also with these, it's not in the picture, but if you wanted to, if you're somebody that's really interested in the compost tea or the leachate that comes from it to use further, you can put a spigot at the bottom of either bucket A or the bottom of this Rubbermaid tote, and that makes harvesting any liquids easier. Or if you just want to be able to empty the liquids, if this is a system that works for you and you want to keep it regularly. Also with this, where you put your system is kind of important. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a cool, dark place, but darker is a little better, but put it someplace where you're not going to forget. It can be your basement, but it can also be a laundry room. If you're managing it well, it shouldn't smell. It should just do its thing, and everything should be earthy smelling as it's processing. Next slide. All right, well, we'll go into compost tea. So compost tea, I'm sure a lot of people are hearing more and more about it. It's becoming more of a trend or a niche-y thing. I think that we're starting to become more of less is more, zero waste, as we're going further, and we see that the climate change and all that. I think that we're trying to use this from start to finish, and I think the compost tea is a good thing. So we'll go into that on the good and the bad, and what you can use it for essentially. Next slide. So what is compost tea? Compost tea is the liquid that comes from your compost pile, your vermicomposting. You can make it if you want to take a bag of finished compost soil and put it in a bucket, 5-gallon bucket full of water to leachate out nutrients from the soil. But if you do make it yourself, there's a whole lot more that goes into it. It's not just taking what has rolled off of your compost pile. The stuff that comes right off your compost pile is nutrient dense. So you're going to want to use it cautiously, kind of like the castings. It's probably going to be very strong. So you're going to want to dilute it with a ratio of water. It doesn't have to be a specific science. I would say like 1-to-5 ratio, 1 compost tea, 5 water. And then you can use that either, watering your plants, your indoor plants. You can spray it on the foliage of the leaves, and it's supposed to help suppress diseases. In the soil, it helps with providing a fertilizer, a natural food for your plants. So that's always a benefit. And again, you have this liquid no matter what. So being able to do something with it, I think that's a benefit. The only real potential downside of this is it's not very measured as far as how much nutrients in it. And there could technically be bad bacteria in there. So you want to weigh on the side of caution, because without getting it tested, you don't know exactly what's in there. So I would just, use it as you feel needed. But I also believe, like, don't let it go to waste, because it's there and it's got to have, the benefits to it. So I would say try it. And if it seems to work for your plants and they seem to stay happy and all that, then continue to use it. Next slide. This is where I'm going to pass it over to Marissa, and she'll go into stockpiling.
Hey, thank you, Heather. So I'm going to go over what happens if you have a bunch of food scraps, but you don't really have anywhere to put them, how you can store them so you're making sure that they are not ending up in the garbage. So assuming you do have some sort of backyard compost, or maybe you're using a vermicompost or self-composting system, but it is currently at max capacity, or potentially frozen. If your weather is anything like what's going on in upstate New York right now, you might have a foot of snow on top of your compost. So if you can't access your compost, you don't want to throw out all that beautiful food scraps. We're going to go into how you store the material, then how you add it back into your compost, so that way you're making sure it's keeping your compost healthy. And finally, some other forms of alternative composting if you no longer can stockpile any more food scraps in your house. So when you have compost, you might notice that it slows down or potentially even stops during the winter. The reason is that decomposition really needs warmth for it to happen. It's being done by all these wonderful fungi and microbes, and they are not super happy when it's very cold. This means that your compost pile currently is probably dormant. The very center of it potentially could still be having some good breakdown happening, but a lot of it is not really doing anything, and that's because of the cold. So you can use that to your advantage when you're actually storing food scrap material as well. You can slow decomposition within your food scraps container by putting it in the fridge. So nice picture of it in the fridge right there. This is a great way to prevent odor and bugs all year round as well. So if you have your bucket with your food scraps, especially in the summer when we have to worry about the heat and the bugs, it's a great way to kind of prevent that from happening by storing it in your fridge. So that'll slow down any sort of decomposition. The difference between this container of food scraps and, say, the stealth composter that Debbie was talking about is that it's not a monitored, layered, carefully balanced compost. It's just a bunch of food scraps, which are way too heavy in nitrogen. So instead of getting compost, if the decomposition is allowed to happen in this container, you're just going to end up with kind of a gross, slimy mess. And that's what we're really trying to avoid. So putting in the fridge is a great thing to, again, slow it down. Maybe you're leaving for a week or so. It's a great way to make sure that when you come back, you don't have some pretty gross compost at the bottom of this container. However, it's not going to completely stop decomposition. So to do that, you're going to want to put it in your freezer. By doing that, you're actually going to completely hit the pause button on your food scraps breaking down. So storing them in the freezer is a great way to make sure that you have food scraps that are not breaking down in the container and are there for you when you want them. Essentially, as long as your freezer is still running, they'll still be completely unbroken down. So again, this is something that can be a great way to stockpile your food scraps when you can't access your outdoor compost, but it's also a great place to store your compost as well at any time of the year. So especially if you are doing, if you're going away for a longer period of time, say over the summer, you have some food scraps, you just shove them in the freezer and then you don't have to worry about them anymore. Now, we all don't have unlimited space in our fridges and our freezers, but if you are, again, in a colder climate, outside is currently a giant freezer. So another place you can store your food scraps while you're waiting for access to your compost pile is just right out your door on your porch, you know, if you have a garage area or on your deck. This way you can just reach out the door. You don't have to trudge out to your compost pile, but at the same time, it's staying very cold. Obviously, you need to think about the temperature. So if you are in an area where it doesn't stay below freezing, then it's not really a freezer. It's probably more like a fridge. As long as the outdoor temperature doesn't get above 40 degrees for extended periods of time, then it essentially is like a refrigerator. And then if it's not getting above 32 degrees for extended period of time, you can kind of think of it more like a freezer. You do have to be concerned about the temperature of the bucket in particular, though. So you want to keep monitoring it since it is a small container, especially if it's in a really sunny area and you are somewhere that actually does get some direct sunlight. And if it is a dark color, then it can heat up a lot faster than the ambient air temperature. So while it might be 20 degrees outside, your bucket could get warmer. So just anytime you're putting food scraps in there, just kind of monitor it. If decomposition does start to happen, then that can create heat. So as Debbie and Heather mentioned, when you get things breaking down, heat is actually created, which in this case, you don't want happening because you want those food scraps to stop breaking down. So keep monitoring it. The last thing you want to be concerned about with a porch container is that you have a nice solid lid on there. Now, this is to prevent any sort of critters from coming up and getting into your compost container. If it is frozen, you're probably not going to attract very much, but it's still a good thing to have on hand, especially if it gets knocked over or something like that. You don't want a bunch of food scraps out along your whole porch area. So once you've stockpiled your material, what do you do with it? The best thing is obviously to add it then back into your outdoor compost, but you have to be careful while you're doing that and making sure that you're not overwhelming your outdoor compost pile. If you have the opportunity to add in these food scraps throughout the winter, then take advantage of that. I know even in upstate New York, we've had a couple of spouts of fairly warm weather, you know, in December and January. Take that opportunity and take any of the stockpiled food scraps you have out there and bring them out to your compost pile and add them back in. If it has been a while, maybe you don't have those nice respites of the winter, or it's just been a couple of months, making sure that you're not taking all that stockpiled material and adding it all in at once. You really want to spread it out. So whether you start kind of stockpiling your new material or just taking some of that stockpiled material and adding into your fresh food scraps that you're accumulating every day, take a small amount out every time. The size of your compost pile will depend how much you can actually add in every day. So that will you can kind of be the judge of that and decide whether it's, twice as what you would normally take out, or maybe a lot less or a lot more. One of the ways that you can get rid of a lot of that stockpiled material faster is if your compost pile is breaking down more quickly. And one of the ways you can do that is turning it more often. So anything to increase the rate of decomposition will allow your compost pile to break down faster, and therefore allow you to add in more of that stockpiled material. So turning your compost pile, making your food scraps into smaller pieces, and then any more active monitoring, so making sure that it's not too dry or too wet. Just being a little bit more attentive than you probably normally are to your outdoor compost pile will all allow you to add that stored material in a little bit more frequently. So that way it's not just hanging out in your freezer for most of the summer. When you are adding in all of these materials, one of the things you do want to make sure is that you are not forgetting that brown to green ratio. So both Heather and Debbie kind of touched on this a little bit, but anytime you're adding in your food scraps, they're wet, they're really rich in nitrogen. And your compost pile loves those things, but it doesn't want too much of those things. It also wants carbon material, and it also wants a nice airflow. So you want to make sure that if you're stockpiling your food scraps, your green material, you also need to be stockpiling your brown material. So that way, when you are adding your food scraps back into your compost, you can have a nice, huge amount of brown material to add in as well. The general rule is you need about 3 parts brown to 1 part green. Again, it kind of changes depending on what you're adding into it. Now, there's a lot of ways to stockpile your brown material as well. In the fall, if you rake your leaves, instead of putting them out on the curb for the town or village to collect, you could keep a collection of them yourself in some sort of watertight container, like a bag or a garbage can. They're a great resource. Same thing with any sort of prunings or mulchings that you might have, sawdust. So like Debbie had a bunch of prunings that she used for her brown material in the stealth composting. All of that stuff that is kind of yard waste, you can stockpile it instead and use it. Other things you can use for your brown material, if you got a bunch of packages over the holidays, that cardboard is a great brown material that you can kind of keep to the side. If you have shredded paper, whether from home or from your office, that's a wonderful thing because you can't recycle shredded paper. So it's a great thing to stockpile for your compost instead. And really any paper, as long as it's not glossy, you can use that in your compost. So instead of putting things out in your recycling, you can kind of set them aside. And then when it comes to adding all these green materials back into your compost, then you can have this nice stockpile of brown materials to go along with them. If you have a bunch of stockpiled material already, maybe your freezer is full, your fridge is full, your porch is full, and you still have food scraps, there's options before you start throwing them in the garbage. One of them is using a composting service. So this is very dependent on where you live. I know there's some people from different parts of the country, so I don't want to make generalized statements, but check it out, find out what's in your area. If you are in the Finger Lakes region, obviously Heather has Finger Lakes compost and she will gladly take your compost. But these services will compost year round. So they are still collecting material even during the winter because their piles are hot enough that they're still breaking down very nicely. Some places have pickup right at your house, a curbside pickup. Some places have drop spots, a place that you bring your food scraps. If you live in Tompkins County, there's Cayuga Compost has specific times during the week that you can bring your food scraps. If you are anywhere near Montour Falls, then we actually have 3 drop spots in the area that Heather services. They are open 24/7 and you don't have to be a Montour Falls resident to use them. So just showing quickly for the people in the area where they are, there is one at the Montour Falls Library. There is one in the parking lot for Montour House by North New York. And the third one currently is at the Catherine Court Apartments on Canal Street. We are in the process of getting a couple more set up in Montour Falls, so kind of stay tuned for that. There are a lot of other types of composting options. I'm just going to briefly mention some of these. There are resources for these at the end of the presentation that you can take some time and look at on your own. The first being a counter composter. It's very similar to a stealth composter, but at an even smaller scale. So this is if you basically need some compost. It's not going to get rid of too much of your food scraps because it's generally they're about the size of a 2-liter soda bottle. But if you really want some compost for your houseplants or something like that, it's a great resource because it breaks down fairly quickly since it is such a small size. Another type of compost is the bokashi method. This is something that people can be a little bit unsure about since it seems weird. It uses fungus and it's a very specific bin, and you inoculate it with the fungus. It sounds a little weird, but it's a really great method. It creates a wonderful compost tea that's very, very useful for houseplants, and it has zero smell. So it can sit right on your counter. And then I also mentioned that there's the Compost Services. These are not only just helpful if you have too much food scraps during the winter, but a lot of stuff that you could compost, you don't really want to be putting in your vermicompost or out in your compost pile or in your stealth compost. So things like materials that are labeled compostable, things like meat, dairy, foods cooked in oil, all that sort of stuff that we always say don't put in your compost pile. Most compost services will collect those. Again, this is something that is kind of depending on the service. So see what's available in your area and what they collect. But it might be something that you can do with all those other parts of your food scraps that you currently can't put out in your pile or use in your vermicompost. So this is the list of further resources. Again, you have the slides. If you weren't able to get these links or something was wrong with the slides, let me know. But you see that there's a couple of different resources, well, a lot of them from CC Tompkins, that have some extra information about all the topics that we've covered in this program. So that is the end of the slides. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see what's going on in the chat. All right. Okay, so someone is asking, do the presenters have brochures or handouts of these methods? I'm a compost recycling educator at CC Broome and would love to share these through my programs. That's a great question, Josh. We do have some resources, and CC Tompkins also has a lot as well. So I can email you about them and share all the stuff that we have. Yeah, there's a lot of great resources out there. There's a couple of cooperative extensions that actually have a master composting program, such as CC Tompkins, and they have a lot of really great handouts. And then obviously, we have also created some as well. So I will get those to you. Jonas asked max and min temperatures for vermicomposting. So if Heather, if you want to try and answer Joan's question.
So for the vermicomposting, it's not super finicky, 55 to 75 degrees. You don't want it getting too hot, but you also don't want it to get so cold that the worms slow down and stop processing. So about 55 to 75 would be good. Definitely much lower than an active composting pile.
Great. Okay, if anyone has questions now, you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask them. Oh, we've got a couple more in the chat. Okay, so I see some local restaurants are using takeout containers that are very similar to the cardboard egg cartons. Are those okay for regular backyard composters? Is there a way to tell like the recycling number on plastic? I'm gonna actually send that question over to Heather as well, since she is very well versed into what is allowed and not allowed in compost.
So that one's kind of a hard one, but it's mostly just looking at a lot of companies don't quite label things. I think it's to protect their own butts. But if it looks like it's very much cardboardy, it doesn't have a super sheen on the inside, then you're probably okay. If it does have that shiny layer on the inside, I would question it just because there's, unless it states on it, there's no way to know if that's like a bio-based vegetable plastic. Or you could also do a test run. You could put it in your compost pile, and 99.9% of the time, if it's a plasticky liner that's not going to break down, you'll be able to pull that right out of your pile, and the rest of the cardboard will break down.
Yeah, I'm just gonna add on to that. Definitely, if it has anything like waxy or coating, it's probably not.
Mhm.
But yeah, I know what you mean. The stuff that kind of looks more like egg cartons. If you are adding them into your backyard compost, you do want to kind of rip them up though.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then also if it rips like paper. Yeah. So that's a pretty good test.
Yeah, that's good.
Also, if it did have if it's like really full of like oil or something like that, again, that could go to a composting service, but you probably wouldn't want to put that in your outdoor pile. Someone's asking, so 1/2 pound of worms can eat 1/4 pound of food. How long does that take?
A day, 2 max.
It's very
They're
impressive.
yeah, they're intense, and I think that's why children really take to it, because they really go to town. You won't get a ton of castings, by the day. It takes a few months, but yep, they will eat through about a 1/2 pound to a pound a day. And they eat the bedding too, so it's the whole mix.
Now with the castings, is that something that you also need to age, like with the self-composting, or are those kind of ready to go to put on?
Yep, ready to go.
Okay, great.
And they're in a more fine, crumbly type of texture. So you can just lay it right on, and it'll just, like Debbie had mentioned, it'll slowly sift itself down into the soil, becoming readily available nutrients.
Great. I'll also say that since both of these self-composting and vermicomposting do produce heat, it is also a really nice spot for your cat to hang out. They like to sit on top of the bucket.
Yep.
All right, well, I appreciate everyone for coming, and I'm glad that everyone seemed to really enjoy learning about the composting.